going on, guys? It's Alex here. So today I'm going to be attempting to make a knife using only two major power tools. One of them being an angle grinder, the second one being a drill. Now a drill is only going to be totally necessary if you plan on putting pinned scales on your knife. Other than that, you can pretty much do this entire knife with nothing but an angle grinder. So let me bring you in here real quick and I'll show you the design that I have drawn up, because this design is going to play a relatively important part in how well your knife is going to turn out. So let me show you the key element that I think your knife should have if you plan on using nothing but an angle grinder. Now the key design element here is actually the fact that this knife has 0 plunge lines. Now a plunge line is the area where the bevel meets the ricasso area. Now if you notice, this grind line here comes all the way down and kind of terminates here at the handle. There's no plunge line here whatsoever. That means that we can use pretty much whatever means necessary to grind this bevel in, which is perfect for an angle grinder. Now feel free to pause the video here and copy this design if you like. Although I will warn you that at the end of this video, this design, the finished product, may change a little bit due to what I like to call grinder wander, or basically user error. So keep that in mind, that my finished product may not look exactly like this. Now let's talk steel. Now 1080 is the type of steel. It's a high carbon steel. It holds an edge well. It does a lot of things really well. But the reason that I like 1080 is because it's the easiest steel to heat treat. The heat treating is super simple with 1080. You basically just heat the steel up to cherry red and quench it in canola oil, and you're gonna get a hardened blade. The humble 4.5-inch angle grinder. An angle grinder is probably the first power tool you should buy when it comes to knife making. Grinders are cheap. I bought mine brand new for $59, and it's what most people would call contractor grade. You can buy cheaper grinders on Amazon for around 25 bucks, and also check your local thrift stores and classifieds. I've seen them as low as $10 used. And as you'll see in this video, you can literally use them to make an entire knife. So let's get to the build. First thing you're going to want to do is transfer your design onto the steel. I'm just using spray tack to stick my paper template to the steel, and I'll also use a Sharpie to trace around the outside of the template in case the template decides to come off in the middle of grinding. Then I just clamp the steel in place and start grinding out my design. Now the nice thing about grinders is there's a lot of different grinding discs available for different applications. The disc I'm using is a simple 1/16 inch cutoff disc. If you have to cut out tight areas or go around curves, it's best to make a bunch of smaller straight cuts first, then cut out each piece and grind it flush to the line. A straight grinder wheel won't go around curves. Once I get kind of the rough shape cut out, I'll switch to a 1/4 inch disc. The 1/4 inch disc is nice for finishing up any rough spots you couldn't get with a thinner disc. I'll also use this disc to grind in my bevels. Now typically when you use a grinder, you always want the front of the grinding disc rotating down and throwing the sparks onto the ground. Not only will this prevent kickback, and this should go without saying, but it also keeps the sparks out of your face. Now I'm not going to go into a whole safety spiel, but please do your own research on grinder safety. These are some powerful little things, and in my opinion one of the most dangerous tools, so please be safe. So after I get the rough shape cut out, I'm just going to reinforce my grind lines with a Sharpie and go back to the grinder with a 1/4 inch disc, this time to grind out my bevel. Just take your time and go slow. The key here is to try and get both bevels to meet up exactly in the center of the blade, and also keep the bevels even on both sides. If all you're using is a grinder, like in this video, don't stress if everything isn't perfectly even. I mean, we're making a knife with a grinder here. Once I have the bevels mostly ground out, I'll switch to a sanding flap disc to finish. A flap disc isn't super necessary. You can pretty much heat treat this blade right now and get a totally usable knife. But if you want a more finished look, a flap disc will help save time when it comes to getting out all those grinder lines. These flap discs are very common. I bought these from Home Depot, but you can find them pretty much at any hardware store. I believe I used a 40 grit and an 80 grit here, but if you only want to get one, I'd recommend the 80 grit. It's more than capable of sanding out all the grinder lines. I'm going to do a paracord wrapped handle on this knife, so I'm also using a flap disc to round over any sharp corners on the handle. Now one thing I'm not going to do is round over the corners on the blade. This is because I want to be able to strike a ferro rod with this knife, and a rounded over spine won't make sparks on a ferro rod. Now at this point you really want to make the decision on how well you want to finish the knife. The knife is still in a softened state, so any hand sanding should be done now. Yes, you can hand sand after heat treatment, but it's much more difficult. Now you'll still have to do some sanding after heat treatment regardless, but now is the time to remove any deep scratches from the sanding disc and grinder. If there's any deep scratches remaining after heat treatment, they might as well be permanent, as they can literally take days to hand sand those scratches out. On this knife I wanted a mirror polish on the bevel, so I really took my time here hand sanding. I used 150, 220, 320, 400, 600, and 1500 grit sandpaper before heat treatment. That way I made sure any deep scratches were taken out before the blade was hardened. And I drilled one hole in the back of the handle for my paracord wrap. Really, this hole isn't necessary for a paracord wrap or in general, so if you don't have a drill, you don't need to drill it. Now it's time for the heat treatment. For this I'm using my mini forge. Now don't freak out if you don't have a mini forge, you can build these for around 25 bucks. I have a video on how I made mine and I'll link it below. Now you don't need a mini forge for heat treating. You can use any regular propane torch if your blade is small enough. I've even used a camping stove to do my heat treatment. Also a forced air campfire works just as well. There's tons of ways to heat a knife for heat treating. All you need is some way to heat the steel to 1475 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically what I do is turn the lights off in my shop so I can see the color of the steel. I'll also use a magnet to test the temperature of the steel as it becomes non-magnetic at around 1425 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the steel becomes non-magnetic, I put it back into the heat for a minute or so just to get that little bit of extra heat into the blade. Then I quench in canola oil that's been heated to around 130 degrees Fahrenheit. For 1080 steel, you can really use any oil, but I wouldn't recommend using motor oil or anything like that, as the tempering will be done inside your home oven. Canola oil or vegetable oil works best in this scenario if you don't want toxic fumes in your house. To preheat your oil, you can use a torch or heat a piece of scrap steel and drop it in the oil, or like I'm doing here and simply using a DIY alcohol stove. Whatever you use, you want the oil around 130 degrees Fahrenheit. This thins out the oil and actually helps cool the blade faster during the quench. 1080 needs to be cooled at a very fast rate in order for it to harden. Now you technically can use water to quench 1080, but water is a very violent quench. It can cool the steel too fast and cause a crack, which is not good for knives. Now I'm not saying water can't be used without cracking, but the risk is much greater than with oil. Now we have hardened the blade, but at this point the blade is too hard and can crack or shatter if you went ahead and tried to baton through a piece of wood, or even dropped it onto the ground. So in order to bring the hardness down, we need to temper the knife in a home oven. I usually temper 1080 for 2 cycles at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours each, allowing the knife to cool to the touch between cycles. Tempering will bring the hardness down and increase the toughness of the blade, which I'll demonstrate at the end. Now it's time to finish the blade. Now since I did most of my finishing work before heat treatment, this part goes pretty quick. I'll just hand sand with the grit I finished with pre-heat treatment, and I'm practically done. But in this case I wanted more of a mirror polish on the bevel, so I just used a piece of leather and some polishing compound and spent the next several hours polishing. The knife is still a blank canvas at this point and can be finished as much or as little as you want. None of the finishing work really impacts how well the knife will cut. It's mostly just for looks at this point. Now because I used a grinder with a flap disc for the bevels, this knife has what's called a convex grind, and just through the hand sanding / finishing part will end up being sharpened. Basically the bevel ends up being curved all the way down to the apex, meaning there's no secondary bevel on this blade. Now I could go into a whole video on sharpening a convex blade, but for the sake of time I'm just going to have to leave it at that. You're basically just working the edge with sandpaper until you form an apex. I'd advise against going back to the grinder for sharpening, as the grinder may introduce too much heat into the steel and ruin your temper, in which case you'll have to start all over again with a heat treatment. So after getting to a point where you're happy with the finish, you can leave the knife as is and you're done, or you can go do a simple paracord wrap like I'm going to do here. Now again, I could make a whole separate video on how to do a paracord wrap, but since I'm not super good at it and just kind of winging it here, I'm not going to do a super good job at explaining it. If you want a more detailed explanation, there's already hundreds of videos showing how it's done. There's also a lot of different wrapping techniques you can use, but all in all, it's really a pretty easy thing to to do. Now as far as I'm concerned, at this point the knife is finished. It's a little rough around the edges, but keep in mind, it's made with an angle grinder. If you start in the morning and end in the evening, there's no reason you can't make this in a day with an angle grinder and some basic tools. So now let's see what it can do. So this ending shot of me shaving my arm was done after hacking through a 2x4, cutting up a bunch of cardboard, which I recorded out of frame, and literally hammered the blade through a bunch of oak. So edge retention is pretty good. Hopefully this goes to show the power of simple high carbon steel, a convex grind, and some elbow grease. As always, I hope this video was helpful. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.